What most people misunderstand about empaths is the timing of their exit. They imagine it happens suddenly, like a switch flipping after one betrayal, one harsh argument, one moment of emotional pain that finally becomes too much. But that's not how it works. That's the visible ending, not the real process. An empath doesn't leave at the moment things break. They leave long after the pattern has already been established in their nervous system. What looks like a sudden disappearance is actually the final stage of something that has been building quietly for a long time, through repetition, not explosion. Because empaths don't experience relationships in isolated events. They experience them as emotional ecosystems. Every interaction leaves a trace. Every dismissal, every moment of being misunderstood, every time their emotional input is minimized, it doesn't disappear. It accumulates. And unlike more emotionally detached personalities, they don't reset easily. They process deeply. They reflect. They analyze meaning where others might only see behavior. So what actually leads to their disappearance is not drama. It's pattern recognition. At first, they rationalize imbalance. They tell themselves maybe they didn't mean it, or they're just stressed, or it will be different next time. Empaths are often highly tolerant in the beginning because their baseline assumption is emotional reciprocity. They assume other people are also trying, also feeling, also aware. That assumption keeps them invested far longer than most people realize. But over time, something changes internally. Not in their emotions, but in their interpretation of those emotions. The same situations that once felt like misunderstandings start to feel like data points. And those data points begin to form a pattern they can no longer ignore. This is where the shift begins, not in anger, but in clarity. The empath starts noticing that the emotional effort is one-directional. That repair is always initiated by them. That understanding always requires their patience, their translation of feelings, their adaptation. And slowly, the relationship stops feeling like connection and starts feeling like maintenance work. Psychologically, this is where emotional fatigue sets in. Not because they lack love, but because love without reciprocity creates internal friction. The empath begins to associate closeness with depletion. And once that association forms, something very important changes in how they engage. They don't argue more. They argue less. They don't express more emotion. They begin to compress it. They stop trying to fix things not because they don't care, but because they start to recognize that care alone is not producing change. This is the stage most people miss entirely. They assume everything is fine because the empath is still present, still polite, still responsive. But internally, something has already started to withdraw. Attention narrows. Emotional investment becomes selective. Energy is conserved instead of offered freely. And here is the critical psychological truth. Empaths rarely exit at the peak of conflict. They exit at the peak of clarity. The moment they realize that the pattern is not temporary, not situational, but structural, that it will continue unchanged no matter how much they give. At that point, something quiet but irreversible happens. The emotional cost of staying becomes higher than the emotional fear of leaving. And once that equation flips, the decision is no longer reactive. It becomes logical. They don't leave because they suddenly stop caring. They leave because caring no longer changes the outcome. And when that realization settles in, the exit is often silent. No confrontation, no final argument, just a gradual withdrawal that feels almost invisible until one day it becomes undeniable that they are no longer emotionally available in the same way. Because in their mind, the relationship didn't end in a moment. It ended in a pattern they could no longer justify staying inside. And once an empath stops justifying your place in their emotional world, they don't announce their departure. They simply become someone who is no longer there, long before you realize it. The fastest way to lose an empath is not through conflict, betrayal, or even dishonesty in the obvious sense. Those things can be painful, yes, but they are not what creates permanent withdrawal. What actually triggers the deepest disengagement is something far more subtle and far more consistent: emotional invisibility. When an empath enters a relationship, they are not simply observing behavior. They are constantly tracking emotional signals, tone, timing, micro-expressions, shifts in energy, and what is left unsaid. Their mind is built to detect emotional nuance that most people overlook entirely. Because of this, they don't just want to be heard. They want to be emotionally acknowledged in a way that confirms, "You are seen here. Your internal world is real to me." And at first, that sensitivity works in both directions. They often become the emotional interpreter in relationships. They notice when something is wrong before it is spoken. They adjust their behavior to maintain harmony. They absorb tension quietly, sometimes even preemptively smoothing out emotional friction before it escalates. But over time, this creates an imbalance that is not immediately visible to the other person. One side becomes highly attuned, while the other may become unconsciously dependent on that attunement without offering it in return. And this is where emotional invisibility begins, not as a single act, but as a pattern of being emotionally unrecognized. It doesn't always look dramatic. In fact, it often looks ordinary. Conversations continue. Time is spent together. But when the empath expresses something internally significant, stress, discomfort, emotional fatigue, it is subtly redirected, minimized, or bypassed. The focus shifts back to the other person's needs, their schedule, their perspective, their interpretation. And the empath notices. Not immediately in a confrontational way, but internally as a slow withdrawal of emotional validation. They begin to feel like their inner experience is not landing anywhere meaningful, that their emotional expressions are passing through the relationship without being fully received. This is where something very important happens psychologically. The empath stops expecting resonance. Once that expectation is weakened, they begin to change their behavior. At first, they explain themselves more clearly. They try to communicate better. They adjust tone, timing, wording, thinking that maybe clarity is the issue. But clarity is not the problem. Reception is. And when repeated attempts at emotional expression do not produce recognition, a deeper shift begins. The empath starts to conserve emotional output. They stop sharing the more vulnerable layers of their inner world. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they begin to unconsciously categorize certain emotions as unreceived. This is the beginning of emotional withdrawal while still physically present. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. In fact, things may even look smoother. Less tension, fewer emotional discussions. But internally, the relationship has changed categories. It is no longer a space of emotional exchange. It becomes a space of observation. And this is where many people misinterpret what is happening. They assume the absence of emotional expression means stability. But for an empath, it often means the opposite. Silence is not peace. It is recalibration. Because when an empath feels emotionally invisible for long enough, they begin to shift their investment. They no longer orient their behavior around being understood. They orient it around reducing emotional exposure. They become more self-contained, more internally processed, less externally dependent on relational feedback. And once that shift is complete, something irreversible starts forming. They stop trying to be emotionally known in that space at all. That is the real danger. Not anger, not confrontation, but absence of emotional pursuit. Because once an empath no longer believes that their inner world will be accurately received, they don't fight for visibility. They withdraw into self-sufficiency, and at that point, the relationship is no longer failing loudly. It is dissolving quietly, and most people only realize what happened when they finally reach for them emotionally, and there is no longer anyone there reaching back. Because emotional invisibility doesn't create chaos in the moment. It creates disappearance over time. And when an empath reaches that stage, the silence you're left with is not empty. It is final. Attachment styles are one of those concepts people like to mention casually, but very few actually understand how deeply they shape behavior in relationships. They are not just labels, anxious, avoidant, secure. They are internal operating systems that determine how a person handles closeness, distance, emotional pressure, and perceived rejection. When you look at empaths through this lens, something becomes very clear. Many of them are not simply sensitive people. They are often highly attuned individuals trying to navigate relationships with partners whose attachment systems operate very differently from their own. In many cases, the empath leans toward anxious attachment traits, not in the sense of insecurity as a personality flaw, but as a heightened sensitivity to relational stability. They are constantly scanning for signs of disconnection, not because they are paranoid, but because they are deeply invested in maintaining emotional coherence. To them, inconsistency isn't just inconvenient. It feels like a disruption in emotional reality. On the other side, you often find avoidant patterns in partners. Not always extreme, but enough to create distance when emotional intensity rises. Avoidant attachment is not about lack of feeling. It is about regulation through withdrawal. When emotions become too dense, too demanding, or too close, the system automatically creates space. Now put these two systems in the same environment, and you get a predictable cycle. The empath moves toward connection. The avoidant steps back to regain equilibrium. The more one pursues clarity, the more the other seeks space. Neither is consciously trying to hurt the other, but the nervous systems are speaking completely different languages. And this is where the deeper psychological tension begins. The empath interprets distance as meaning something is wrong, so they increase effort, more communication, more emotional presence, more attempts to repair or reconnect. But to the avoidant system, increased intensity feels like pressure, and pressure triggers further withdrawal. So now you have a loop. Pursuit creates distance, and distance creates pursuit. Over time, this dynamic becomes exhausting for both sides, but especially for the empath, because they begin to internalize the instability as something they are responsible for fixing. They start believing that if they can just communicate better, love harder, or understand more deeply, the cycle will resolve. But attachment systems are not resolved through effort alone. They are stabilized through emotional safety and mutual regulation. And when that doesn't exist, effort becomes amplification of the problem, not the solution. This is where empaths begin to change internally. At first, they double down. They become more patient, more understanding, more accommodating. They try to create safety by reducing friction. But paradoxically, this often erodes their own emotional boundaries. And here is the critical turning point. When an empath starts to feel that closeness requires self-abandonment, the attachment system begins to collapse inward. They stop seeing the relationship as a shared space and start seeing it as a place where they must constantly adjust themselves to remain connected. That realization is not always conscious. It builds slowly. A moment of emotional restraint here, a withheld feeling there, a conversation not initiated, a truth not spoken because it might create distance. Until eventually they are no longer fully present in the relationship, not because they stopped caring, but because being fully present requires too much internal compromise. And ironically, this is where the avoidant dynamic often intensifies, because the empath's withdrawal is misread as comfort or independence, when in reality, it is adaptation through depletion. So both sides begin to lose access to each other. One retreats to preserve space. The other retreats to preserve self. And what remains is a relationship that still exists structurally but not emotionally in the same way. And this is why empaths so often disappear in these dynamics. Not because they cannot handle love, but because they can no longer sustain a version of love that requires them to continuously override their own emotional signals just to maintain connection. Eventually, the nervous system makes a decision before the mind fully articulates it. This pattern is not safe to stay in. And once that decision is made at that level, attachment stops being a bond and starts becoming a distance that no longer needs explanation. Because when an empath finally disconnects from an attachment cycle, they are not running away from love. They are stepping out of a system where love required them to lose themselves in order to keep it alive. And at that point, leaving is not emotional, it is structural, a correction of balance that no longer depends on permission. One of the most overlooked aspects of empath psychology is that they rarely disappear without warning. The exit is not abrupt in the way people imagine. It is not a moment of sudden emotional rupture. It is a gradual, almost imperceptible reduction in presence that begins long before anyone recognizes what is happening. The reason most people miss it is because they are looking for the wrong signals. They expect confrontation. They expect anger. They expect a dramatic emotional announcement that signals something is ending. But empaths don't usually operate that way when they reach their limit. Their system doesn't escalate, it de-escalates. And that de-escalation is the warning. At first, it is subtle enough to be dismissed. The empath who once initiated conversations regularly starts responding instead of initiating. The person who once explored emotional depth begins to keep things lighter. The individual who once asked questions about your inner world begins to focus more on surface-level exchanges. Nothing is said explicitly, but everything is communicated through reduction. They stop overextending themselves emotionally, not because they are playing a game, but because something inside them has already begun conserving energy. Emotional investment becomes more selective. Effort is no longer automatic, it becomes conditional. And most people interpret this incorrectly. They assume stability. They think things are calmer now, but calmness in this context is often not peace, it is withdrawal in progress, because what is actually happening internally is that the empath is recalibrating their emotional output. They are testing whether engagement still produces meaningful connection or whether it simply leads to further imbalance. And when repeated attempts at engagement do not yield emotional reciprocity, something critical begins to shift. They stop reaching, not all at once, but in stages. First, they stop reaching for clarification. Then they stop reaching for repair. Then they stop reaching for emotional depth. And each step feels small in isolation, but together they represent a complete reorientation of relational behavior. From the outside, this can look like independence, even maturity. The empath seems less reactive, less emotionally intense, more composed. But internally, it is not growth, it is withdrawal under observation. They are still present, but they are no longer emotionally extending beyond what is being returned to them. And this is where the warning signs become most dangerous, because empaths do not usually announce emotional depletion. They demonstrate it through absence of escalation. No more emotional conversations initiated. No more attempts to resolve tension that isn't acknowledged by the other side. No more long explanations of how they feel, because those explanations have already been tested and found to have no impact on the system they are in. At this stage, something very important changes psychologically. The empath stops expecting behavioral change from the other person. And once expectation is removed, engagement becomes purely functional. They remain polite, they remain present, they remain responsive. But the emotional layer that once created depth begins to flatten. The relationship still exists in form, but it starts losing its internal volume. This is the phase most people regret later, because it is the last moment where repair is still possible, but it doesn't feel urgent to the other person yet. The empath has not left. So the problem is assumed to be temporary, a phase, a mood, something that will pass. But internally it is already a trajectory, because empaths rarely jump from full engagement to absence. They transition through diminishing investment, and each stage feels less noticeable than the one before it, which is why it is so often missed until it is too late. By the time full withdrawal happens, it doesn't look like a reaction. It looks like completion. Like someone quietly stepping out of a space they had already emotionally left weeks or months earlier. And what makes this so difficult to reverse is that the final stage is not emotional, it is perceptual. The empath no longer perceives the relationship as something that can return to what it was, not because of one event, but because of accumulated evidence. And once that perception settles, they don't leave loudly. They simply stop participating in the version of the connection that no longer exists for them internally. So when the disappearance finally becomes visible, it is not the beginning of the end. It is the end of something that was already gone long before anyone noticed. And the hardest truth is this: by the time you recognize the warning signs, you are often not witnessing a relationship breaking. You are witnessing the final stage of someone who already left emotionally and has only now left physically. When an empath finally leaves, one of the most misunderstood reactions is how quiet it can be. People expect emotion to collapse into anger, confrontation, or visible grief. They assume that because the connection was deep, the ending must also be loud. But that assumption misunderstands the way emotional processing actually works in empaths. By the time they reach the point of leaving, the emotional intensity that once defined the relationship has already been processed internally. What remains is not chaos, it is clarity. And clarity in this context is not emotional noise, it is emotional finality. An empath does not typically leave at the height of feeling. They leave after feeling has already been fully experienced, examined, and metabolized. That is why their exit often appears detached rather than reactive. It is not the absence of emotion, it is the completion of emotional processing. At this stage, they are no longer trying to fix, understand, or reinterpret the relationship. That phase has already passed. What remains is a simple internal conclusion. Continuing this pattern will cost more than it gives back. And once that conclusion forms, something important happens psychologically. The empath stops relating to the relationship as something alive in the present tense. It becomes a reference point, a memory structure, a closed loop in their internal narrative. This is why the departure often feels sudden to the other person, even though it was gradual on the inside. Because the empath does not exit during the breaking point, they exit after the interpretation of the breaking point has already been fully integrated. And when that integration is complete, their behavior changes in a very specific way. Not through emotional escalation, but through emotional neutrality. There is no attempt to provoke understanding anymore. No final arguments meant to make the other person see it. No emotional reopening of unresolved conversations. Because internally, those conversations have already been concluded. Repeatedly, quietly, without external validation. This is where the most difficult part for others begins. The empath no longer seeks closure from the outside. They have already constructed closure internally, and once that internal closure exists, interaction with the past connection becomes unnecessary. They may still speak politely, they may still respond when required, but the emotional investment that once drove engagement is no longer accessible. Not suppressed, simply no longer activated. From a psychological standpoint, this is not detachment in the cold sense. It is the end result of over-involvement without reciprocity. When someone consistently processes emotional depth without receiving equal relational feedback, the system eventually adapts by reducing emotional output entirely. Not to punish, not to manipulate, but to stabilize, and that stabilization looks, from the outside, like emotional distance. What makes empath departure so distinctive is that it rarely includes an attempt to make the other person suffer. There's no need for retaliation, because the energy that would fuel it has already been spent on understanding. The final state is not hostility, it is absence of relational charge. They don't leave to create a reaction. They leave because remaining no longer produces meaning. And this is where the misunderstanding deepens. People often interpret their calmness as indifference, but it is not indifference. It is completion. The emotional system has already done its work. There is nothing left to resolve inside them. So the exit becomes simple, almost understated. A reduction in availability, a decision not to re-enter emotional cycles that have already been internally closed. A quiet step away from a dynamic that no longer requires their participation. And once they are out, they do not orbit back in the way others might expect. Because the empath does not leave with unfinished emotional interpretation. They leave after interpretation has already reached its final form. That is why attempts to pull them back often fail, not because they are strong-willed in a conventional sense, but because there is nothing unresolved left for them to revisit. The emotional file internally has already been archived, and what remains in their place is not anger, not longing, not revenge, but distance that no longer needs explanation. Because when an empath finally disappears from your life, they are not reacting to the present moment. They are confirming a decision their nervous system made long before their body followed it. And in that final silence, the most important truth becomes visible. They did not leave suddenly. They left completely, long before anyone noticed the ending had already happened.